Well, hello and welcome to Models of God. I'm Ted Peters. The material we're going to be looking at here is drawn largely from Chapter 4 of God, the World's Future, Systematic Theology for a Postmodern Era. We'll be asking questions such as, how have people in different times and locations thought about deity and divinity and God? What is the human experience with the divine that leads to the various conceptual models? And how do the models overlap or sharply contradict one another? Why are atheists and agnostics so angry at religious people these days and try to repudiate what it is that religious people think about matters divine? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be quite a ride. Anything the systematic theologian has to say about God, at least God as creator, is going to be connected to Article 1. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Well, some of us believe in God and others don't. According to this poll, 2.5% are atheists who deny the existence of God, and almost two-thirds of the population in the United States affirm at least the existence of God, if not faith in God. Now, the question is, who's right? Like panting for gold, I have sifted through the soil and pebbles of the various religious traditions in the world looking for nuggets, and by nuggets I mean a coherent concept of the divine. This is my list. Take a look at the first one, atheism. Well, theism would be belief in God. You put the privative A in front, you get atheism, or the denial of God. Agnosticism, similarly, begins with the word gnosis, G-N-O-S, meaning knowledge. So you put that A in front of it and you get somebody who says, I really don't know, or I can't prove one way or the other what is true or false. Deism, from the Latin word for God, Deus, is the belief in God, the creator, but who gives the laws of nature to the world, and then the world runs on the laws of nature without any miracles or interventions. That's your famous clockmaker God. Then theism or monotheism, those terms are interchangeable actually. God creates the world, as in the case of deism, but God continues to be involved in the world. Theists tend to believe in miracles. Deists tend to deny miracles. Polytheism, you can tell by the word, poly meaning many, would be belief in many gods. Henotheism is a form of polytheism, but now the many gods are organized in some fashion or another so that the believer chooses one god over the others. Pantheism equates God with the world. That word pan means all, so everything in the world is sacred. Panentheism is a variant on pantheism. God and the world come together in a single package, but God is in the world and the world is in God, but the world does not exhaust God's being. Complex idea, philosophical idea. We'll talk about it. And then finally, pluralism, which is a variant of Henotheism, and it's quite popular today in liberal Protestant Roman Catholic circles. It's a way of recognizing so-called parity or equality amongst the religious traditions. Well, onward. Let's start with this little family of belief in God: polytheism, henotheism, and pluralism. Polytheism literally means belief in many divinities, many gods or goddesses. Before the Europeans arrived in North America, the Amerindians, especially those east of the Mississippi, believed in manitous or spirits, personifications of certain phenomena in nature. There would be a manitou for the bear, manitou for the deer, manitou for trees, but the important thing is to know the manitous were plural in character. When we get to ancient Greece, in the time of the Iliad or the Battle of Troy, for example, we have a very robust polytheism. Here, Peter Paul Rubens pictures Zeus with his head in his hand. Zeus is the god of the sky, the god of the lightning bolt, and comforting him here is the beautiful Aphrodite, the goddess of love, comes into Latin as Venus. Perhaps the most dramatic of contemporary polytheistic societies is Hinduism in India. Here is a large balloon of Ganesh, the elephant god, who looks out for your and my better interests. Still within Indian polytheism, we have the god Vishnu, who becomes manifest in a variety of avatars. So the divinity of one god slips into and energizes the divinity of others. We're now turning to henotheism. Henotheism is polytheism, but with a slight change, namely, one God is more important than others. There are two types of henotheism, to my observation. One is that all of the gods that are familiar are organized, ranked in a hierarchy, and the top god becomes more important than the others. The second form of henotheism is the recognition that different cultures, different nations worship different gods, and so there's a tacit, if not overt, recognition. Other people worship other gods. I worship my God. My God is top God, but we'll let others do what they do. Let's take a little visit back to ancient Egypt, and we'll assume that Egypt, as the civilization we know, begins somewhere around 3000 before the Common Era. It was certainly rising prior to that. But the dominant theology for much of its 3,000+ years is polytheistic in character. Atom is the sun god, and in certain creation myths, sun god rises out of the primeval waters of Nun. Adam and Nun have children, Shu and Tefnut, grandchildren, Geb, who is the earth, and Nut. The sky is feminine in Egyptian mythology. Grandchildren, Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys. Um, Polytheism, yes, but let's look a little bit more closely. Now, try to imagine what the land we call Egypt might have looked like 5,000 years ago. A bunch of city states had grown up. along the Nile River. They're all independent. They have their own economies, uh, probably their own mayors and city councils, and their own religions, their own gods and goddesses. And along comes a strong man, builds an army, and decides to conquer all these city-states. Well, this guy's name happens to be Menes, a pharaoh, and he conquers them one by one, increases his army, and finally goes after the largest and most influential of the city-states, place called Heliopolis. I have no idea what it was called in Egyptian, because Heliopolis is obviously the name given it by the Greeks, helio meaning sun and polis meaning city. When Pharaoh Menes finally becomes king of all Egypt, Upper Egypt, which is in the south, and Lower Egypt, which is in the north, and all the city-states now are under his rule, he establishes a new capital at a place called Memphis. No, not Memphis, Tennessee, where Elvis Presley is buried. No, this is the original Memphis on the Nile River. And as I said, we're looking for that move from polytheism to henotheism, and the character at the center of this is a god named Ptah, P-T-A-H. Here's a little statue of Ptah. At Memphis, the priests, under the rule of the new pharaoh Menes, come up with a myth. Now, let's pay attention to this myth of creation. I think it's amazing, frankly. When I ran into this text at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, it knocked my socks off. But so we're talking, 4,800 years ago, something like that. Here's the myth. There came into being as the heart, a word that could be translated mind. The ancient Egyptians, by the way, thought that the mind is in the center of our body, not like today. Our neuroscientists all think the mind is somehow connected with the brain that sits between our ears. That's a new development. So there came into being as the heart, and there came into being as the tongue, speech. So the heart speaks through the mouth, and something in the form of Adam. Now remember back a couple slides ago in the ENNEAD, the 9 gods of Egyptian polytheism, most likely the gods of Heliopolis before Menes arrives. The sun god Adam is a product of Ptah's thought in his mind and his speech. So Ptah speaks, and Adam, the sun god, comes into existence. The mighty one is Ptah, who transmitted life to all the gods. Indeed, all the divine order really came into being through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. So take that, you citizens of Heliopolis. You may think your 9 gods are important, but I'm telling you this, they're nothing more than a thought that originated with Ptah, and Ptah spoke, and they came into existence. So the 9 gods of the ENNEAD are not just random, they're now ranked as the product of the top god, Ptah. Now, what I find amazing here is the level of philosophical abstraction to deal in this myth of creation with thought and speech. But I'm trying to think phenomenologically. Think with me for a minute. Okay, so you're a citizen of Heliopolis, or maybe one of the other Egyptian city-states. A war is just finished. Uh, Pharaoh Menes sits on the throne. He's asked his priests now to concoct a religion that unites all of Egypt under his rule. So he takes the 9 most popular gods, probably, and he orders them in such a way that Menes' own god, Ptah, rules all the others. Now, where did he get this idea that somehow or other a thought and a word would be creative? All right, here's what I imagine. So there is King Menes sitting on his throne, and the chief accountant comes in, and Pharaoh Menes says, "Well, how are the profits from our grain sales coming in?" And the accountant reads off some numbers, and he says, "Well, I would like to have," the Pharaoh says, "I would like to have you, withdraw some money here and deposit some money there." And the accountant says, "Sure will," and leaves. The Pharaoh's word created action, and so also the military generals come in, the king gives them an order, and they leave, and they do what he says. Could it be, I'm imagining now, could it be that the god Ptah in this creation myth looks like a divine form of King Menes? My own observation is that most of the creation myths in the ancient world that we know, and we know quite a bit about them, tend to give divine authority to the ruling king. In fact, every myth that I know of in the ancient world does that, except one, the ancient Hebrews of the Bible. No, there aren't any myths about the God giving power to the king in the Hebrew experience. Now, it is the case that the Hebrew people and their entire history are the chosen people of God, to be sure. But there's no way the king can claim any particular divinely bestowed authority. The Henotheism of Pharaoh Menes in Egypt makes Ptah the top god and all the other gods subordinate. When we get to ancient Israel, there's a different kind of Henotheism that's pointed out. Remember the story of Ruth. Ruth's mother-in-law is named Naomi, and she's living in a foreign country named Moab. Naomi has a husband and 2 sons. The 2 sons marry Moabite women. Then the husband dies and the 2 sons die, so that leaves Naomi with 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi says, my social security check isn't really very big, but if I go back to my homeland, Israel, I think I'm going to be better taken care of now as a widow. And then Orpah and Ruth say, "But we should go with you, Naomi." And no, she says, "You stay here. Moab is your country. You should stay here." And Orpah says, "Okay," she stays there. But Ruth, she really wants to go back to Israel with her mother-in-law. And she clings to her, and then she gives this wonderful speech in chapter 1, where Ruth says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." And this beautiful passage is frequently sung in our own era at weddings because it expresses the passion of Ruth. And of course, Naomi relents and takes Ruth with her back to Israel. What's interesting is that Ruth assumes if she changes country, she's going to change gods. The god of Moab, the chief god, was a guy named Chemosh, who ate little babies for sacrifices. Not particularly a kind of God that I'd like to have faith in. But that doesn't seem to be a theological issue for Ruth. She just assumes if I go to Israel, I'm going to worship Israel's God. That's it. Do we have any henotheists today that you could invite over for dinner? Well, to some extent, those people who call themselves the religious pluralists continue the henotheistic tradition. Step one, you can see this Paul Knitter quote here. He wants parity between all the religions. Our own religion is not absolute or even superior. So if you're living in a country where Christianity is your religion and the country across the ocean has Hinduism or Buddhism as its religious tradition, you must treat all of them as equal and don't say your own religion is superior. That is Knitter's point. So that would be polyreligiosity or pluralism. But pluralists go one step further. Let's take a look at philosopher John Hick, what he calls the pluralistic hypothesis. The great world faiths embody different perception and conceptions of the real from within the major variant ways of being human, and that within each of them, the transformation of human existence from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness is taking place. So all those equal religions point to something beyond them. And that is what Dr. Hick calls the real. What has happened here within religious pluralism, what I call Supra-Confessional Universalism, is that all of the religions are made equal and subordinate. So Christianity is not better than Islam, or Buddhism is not better than Taoism. And all of them, in their equality, are now subordinate to one higher reality called the real that Dr. Hick, the philosopher, knows about. All the religions are equal, but the philosopher is more equal than the religions because the philosopher has access to the real, just as Pharaoh Menes had access to the god Ptah. So today's religious pluralism looks a whole lot like ancient henotheism. We have just looked at polytheism, henotheism, and religious pluralism. Now we're going to turn to four models for understanding God's relationship to the world: deism, theism, pantheism, and panentheism. Fasten your seatbelt. The classical deist draws a sharp distinction between God on the one hand and the created world on the other. God creates out of nothing. If it weren't for God, there would be no world. When God creates the world out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, God designs the world like a Swiss craftsman designs a wristwatch or a clock, very carefully matching gears to gears. In the case of the deistic God, those gears are the laws of nature. So once God brings the world into existence, places all the laws of nature where they belong, winds it up and sends it down the corridor of history, operating according to these laws, the world is on its own, so to speak. And the deists love the natural scientists because the scientists can study the world, learn the laws of nature, and indirectly then learn the mind of God, just as if you would take apart a Swiss watch, you'd learn something about the mind of the watchmaker. Deists tend not to believe in miracles. The laws of nature take care of things, and in fact, science would be disrupted if it had to contend with miracles that break laws of nature. Now, that's the basic deist position. Some deists add a couple of items. First, God is light, and you and I live in darkness. So our task is to study through reason and through science to see the light. Then another addition is divine providence, that God tries to see to it that good things happen, but God uses the laws of nature that he put there in the first place in order to make those good things happen. To the extent that Albert Einstein, the famous physicist, affirmed the role of God in the world, it was a deistic God who gave the world its laws of nature and in a deterministic fashion, so that the laws of nature don't ever actually go on a holiday, no miracles here. He had to defend this view over against Niels Bohr and the physicists in Copenhagen when they affirmed indeterminism to describe subatomic activity. And Einstein, even though the evidence pointed towards indeterminism, could not give up his confidence that the laws of nature obtain universally and always. And so he made the remark that the old one doesn't play dice. That is to say, the universe is determined by the laws of nature. It's not subject to contingency and chance. Well, up until this point, Einstein has lost the argument, but his disciples continue today vehemently to support his position, trying to find the evidence that will make it persuasive. The golden age of deism was the 17th and 18th centuries. We find it very influential in the Unitarian tradition and the Freemasons. When Mozart wrote his Zauberflöte, or the magic flute, it was a deistic theme for Freemasonry. Many of America's founders in the 1770s had proclivities toward deism, and you can see how the Masons influenced our money. The eye of God, the all-seeing eye that watches over us, is watching over the great American experiment with democracy, a heritage that North Americans shared with Great Britain and France. God has favored our undertaking. That's the deistic God. And what is coming into existence as the great democratic experiment is the new order of the ages. So America's not a miracle, but somehow or other, working through nature and history, God is bringing the new order of the ages into being. That's deism. God creates the world out of nothing, fixes the laws of nature, and sends the world along its way. The God of theism or monotheism similarly creates the world out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. sets the laws of nature, sends the world on its way, but remains involved, remains interactive. God influences the course of events, both in the incarnation and in spiritual presence. And if you're going to affirm God's miraculous action, more than likely you're a theist and not a deist. Let's go back to ancient Egypt again. And let me tell you a story that may have little, if anything, to do with the previous story about the god Ptah, Pharaoh Menes, and Henotheism. This could be the first attempt at monotheism 1500 years later. We're talking about a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep IV and his beautiful and charming wife, Nefertiti. It was Amenhotep who made an attempt to create a monotheism by denying the existence of all those Egyptian gods and affirming the existence of one and only one God, the sun. Could be called Aten, Amun, or Re. Our notion of sun's rays come from this period of time. His favorite name for the god was Aten, so he changed his name to Akhenaten. Sometimes you'll see it with an I, but here I've got it spelled with an A, Akhenaten. And it was the sun that delivers power. Now, here is a hymn to Aten that appeared during the reign of Amenhotep IV. Sole God, like whom there is no other, thou didst create the world according to thy desire while you were alone. All people, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth, walking on feet, and what is on high, flying with wings. So Aten, the sun god, created all things. Take a look at this inscription. We now have Akhenaten, the king or the pharaoh, and his beautiful wife, Nefertiti. And note how the sun is blessing them. The rays of the sun give divine authority to the king and the queen of Egypt. Well, it appears that this monotheism that blessed the royal house lasted only one generation. And then it was obliterated. Why? Well, eventually King Tut took the throne, Tutankhamun, and he rejected the monotheism of Akhenaten. He reinstated the polytheism, not the henotheism, but the polytheism of Egypt. And he gave reasons that during the reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, things didn't go well. The stock market plummeted. The empire did not prosper. So this one god, Aten, the sun god, didn't do a very good job of taking care of the country. So that's a good reason to stop believing in that god and bring back the many gods of Egyptian polytheism. And Akhenaten, or I'm sorry, King Tut made an attempt actually to get rid of all the evidence that a previous generation had for theism or monotheism. Now, what's interesting is Sigmund Freud, the psychiatrist at the end of the 19th century, gave us a theory that because Moses, the Hebrew, grew up in Egypt, that somehow or other Moses had gotten a hold of this monotheism and borrowed it and took it to Israel. Almost no scholar agrees with Freud on this because the God, the monotheistic God of Akhenaten, doesn't look anything like the monotheistic God of Israel, and we'll try to demonstrate that in a minute. Take a look at Moses. This is a statue of Moses in Berkeley. Unfortunately, about commencement time in the spring, and the students have a nice way of decorating Moses. The artist had tried to depict Moses here striking the rock at Mamre and water. That's a miracle of Moses. Came out to quench the thirst of the Hebrew people. Well, if you recall the story, Moses grew up as a Hebrew slave in Egypt, and probably maybe 3 or 4 decades after Akhenaten and King Tut, probably Pharaoh Ramses II was on the throne during this period. And Moses fled Egypt and spent a fair amount of time in the wilderness at the foot of Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, has 2 different names. And Moses is struck by a burning bush that just fascinates him, and he approaches the bush. The bush is burning, but it's not consumed. And Moses engages the bush in a conversation. And Moses realizes that the God of Israel is speaking to him and calling him to liberate his people from their slavery back in Egypt. And so Moses asks the voice, "Who are you? What is your name?" Now, this leads to a crisis moment. In the ancient world, contrary to today's world, in the ancient world, it was believed that words within language have an ontological connection with that to which they refer, that somehow or other the being of things is attached to the words we use and the names we use to identify them. So that's what makes witchcraft work. If you were to recite a chant or a hex, you could somehow or other affect what happens. And so if somebody gets your name, they could use your name and get power over you. So when Moses asks the voice, "Give me your name," then if Moses gets the name, he's going to have power over. No way. So here's what the voice in the bush answers extremely cleverly. Eya asher eya in Hebrew, I am who I am. Could be translated, I will be who I will be. That's not a name. "Give me your name," Moses asks the bush, and he gets an answer, "Well, I am who I am." Well, if I go back to Egypt and I say to the Hebrews, "Who should I tell him sent me?" God answers, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." Boy, that voice was clever. Here's Moses at Easter time, dressed appropriately. So this God with no name, in fact, probably the word God doesn't exactly fit either. Our English word God comes from theos and Greek, which referred to Zeus and Aphrodite and the other gods and goddesses. And this voice that spoke to Moses is certainly not anything like Zeus or Aphrodite, that's for sure. So the voice that speaks to Israel has no name and no images either. Take a look at Exodus chapter 20. We're getting ready now for the Ten Commandments. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the houses of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or an image. So God has no name. God doesn't have any image. The one who is choosing Israel is transcendent, not part of this world, not ordinary, not one God among others. In fact, the word God, it's questionable as to whether that word should even be used or not. Let's think out loud for a minute about idolatry. The Byzantine Church, the Russians, the Greeks, and Romanians and others include icons in their worship. The icon is not art. Art is a Western invention. No, the icon is a window. You look first superficially at the picture, then you see through the window to divinity beyond. If you're going to commit idolatry as a Byzantine Christian, you're going to confuse the window with what you see beyond. Martin Luther places idolatry not in the eyes, but in the heart. Trust and faith of the heart alone makes both God and idol. You and I have a strong inclination to believe in God. We similarly have a strong inclination to manufacture an image of that God that fits our most mundane desires. And when we have passion and commitment, that's an expression of the heart. You're in my heart. Passion, faith, commitment. They're the things that define your and my devotion. We're going to be devoted to either God or to an idol. The task of the Christian faith is to choose the true God and not some lesser substitute. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion is really concerned about maintaining the transcendence of God, the beyond of the God. And even if you and I were to say that God is being itself, or the ground of being, we would be working with that little concept in our mind of what being is. And God is so beyond that God can't even be captured in a category such as that. So, like Luther, Jean-Luc Marion recognizes the role of your and my heart or subjectivity. His word is gaze. The idol depends on the gaze that it satisfies, not the objective content of the icon. No, on your and my inclination to see God as less than what God truly is. Your and my inclination to finitize the infinity of God. Well, when C.S. Lewis was told by his mother that he couldn't have any conceptual images of God, he sat down to try to think about God without having any images. And after considerable thought, he described God as a great massive sea of gray tapioca. Well, it's impossible for you and me to have a meaningful relationship with God that doesn't have an image attached to it. Could there be? Could there be an image of God which in itself does not idolatrize God? An image that is totally open to the beyond? Yes. Who's that? Well, that's Jesus Christ. One person and two natures. So Jean-Luc Marion looks to St. Paul, and Jesus Christ is the icon tu theou, the visible image of the invisible God. To worship Christ is to worship God without idolatry. Well, this rather convoluted yet subtle point regarding idolatry is extremely important, as with Moses and the Christian tradition, God is beyond, God is transcendent, and what happens in your and my subjectivity is really important. We're going to turn now to the axial breakthrough, to the dawning on human consciousness of just what it means to have an awareness of the divine that you cannot capture in finite pictures, statues, or even concepts. Well, let's leave Moses for a moment before the burning bush and enter into a much larger chapter in the story of human history, that roughly the first millennium before the Common Era, and what takes place in Greece and India and in China. We call this the axial breakthrough. There was a breakthrough into human consciousness, the dawning of a new light, a transformation of the human mind. A window opened so that the human mind could see beyond what is mundane to realities that transcend the ordinary world within which we live. And those gods of polytheism, they belong to this world. They are intracosmic. Human consciousness is now visited by that which is supra-cosmic or otherworldly in character. Well, let's start with ancient Greece, maybe a number of centuries after Moses, and the great triumvirate, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I only have Plato and Aristotle pictured here, but as Plato reports, Socrates was arrested and put on trial in the ancient city of Athens. His crime? Atheism. Socrates disbelieved in the gods of Zeus and Aphrodite and all of those as being mundane, as being ordinary. The insight that came to Socrates is that beyond everything that is ordinary, there is a single transcendent God without a name, without a form, that you cannot draw a picture of or make a statue of. But because Socrates rejected the gods of polytheism, he was called an atheist, someone who doesn't believe in God. Well, Plato and Aristotle refined this insight of Socrates. Meanwhile, over in India, the second stage in the Brahmanic tradition, the first stage being a collection of books called the Vedas, the second stage are the Upanishads, and we find something similar going on in the Upanishads, namely a dawn of human consciousness in which a new light shines about a comprehensive total reality beyond name and beyond form, but which creatively generates everything that has names and forms. The Hindus called it Brahman. Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the Sakyamuni who became the Buddha, comes out of that Upanishadic tradition with his insight, and he sees the logic of the fullness of being and the emptiness of being as equivalent. But for whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist, this world, somewhat delusional compared to the really real, which transcends it. Lao Tzu over in China, along with Confucius, do understand that heaven stands in judgment over what happens on earth. Lao Tzu, likely the author of the Tao Te Ching, has a similar view as what we see in other parts of the world during this period we call the axial breakthrough. Well, I would like to connect Moses with these other insights into transcendence and immanence. We're looking at chapter 4 of the book, God the World's Future, which is a systematic theology which looks at models of God structurally or conceptually. Wrote another book called God and Cosmic History, and that tells the story of how these models of God developed in history. God as Moses experienced God was intensely personal in character. The God of Israel heard the cries of agony coming up from the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm reached into Egyptian history and rescued his people and liberated them and brought them to the promised land. The language and the thought forms and the symbols of Israel's experience with Moses' God was personal in character. When we go to Athens, Greece, however, that transcendent God that Socrates spoke of and that Plato and Aristotle dressed in philosophical concepts became ontologized and metaphysicalized. And you might say, well, so what? Well, here's why that's important. A couple centuries before the time of Jesus, Jewish intellectuals translated the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language, and that Greek language was filled with the influences of Plato and Aristotle. And that word theos, Jupiter and Aphrodite were theoi that Socrates did not believe in, now becomes the word for describing Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so on the eve of the New Testament now, Jewish people are believing in the God of Israel filtered through the categories of Greek philosophy. And the train leaves the station with Jews and Christians on board, winding its way for 1,000 years until the Muslims get on board. And these three religions traditions develop what we now call classical theism. Classical theism, whether you like it or not, that's the term. And Rene Descartes, on the eve of the modern world, is probably the one who gives us a succinct picture of God as a classical theist thinks by the name God. Okay, we got a name now. Remember, Moses didn't get a name, but we've got a name. God, that's the translation of theos, is now God's name. By the name God, I understand a substance. A substance. By the name God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and by which I myself and everything else, if anything else does exist, have been created. So that's the voice speaking to Moses in the burning bush, translated through the metaphysical and ontological categories of the great Greeks, entering through Latin and French and English into the position we now know of as classical. Perhaps the champion of classical theism in Judaism would be Moses Maimonides. In Islam, Averroes. In Christianity, it is St. Thomas Aquinas, without a doubt. According to St. Thomas, God is immutable, impassible, unchangeable, actus purus, that is to say, pure act. David Griffin objects. David belongs to that club of process panentheists, which would include John Cobb and Schubert Ogden, Marjorie Suhaki, and others, who object to the classical theist understanding of God because God lacks relationship to the dynamics of history. If you and I get a toothache, the God of classical theism can't feel our pain. So Griffin objects to Thomas Aquinas because the notion of God being immutable or pure act implies that God does not have any passive power, any unactualized potential. God doesn't have any power of being acted upon and responding. We want God to be able to respond if we're going to have a relationship. Well, the problem with this particular argument is Griffin doesn't recognize that for St. Thomas Aquinas and most Christian classical theists who are Trinitarians, there is no incompatibility between classical theistic metaphysics on the one hand and God being personal and interactive and relational on the other. Why? Because God is personal. What Griffin has done here is falsely ascribe to the classical theist the reduction of God to the attributes. So you end up with only an immutable attribute. But God is personal. That is to say, God can remain God and in that sense unchanging, even while God responds to what happens to God's beloved creatures within history, just as you can remain who you are, even though you respond to some dramatic need which appears in your life. The God of classical theism is personal, not reducible to immutability or any other attributes. Elizabeth Stump is one of the great philosophical scholars who, in her retrieval of St. Thomas Aquinas, makes it very clear that if we understand God personally and relationally, that this is in no way incompatible with the ontology of classical theism. The plan of God is changing, says Dr. Stump, but God is not changing. An immutable, eternal God is maximally responsive to his temporal creation. Now, let me try to tell this story one more time. Moses has this experience with God as utter transcendence. There is no way Moses can grab God by the collar, can't even get his name, can't draw a picture of him. Utter transcendence. Yet, the language of Moses, the language of the ancient Hebrews, is personal in character. It describes God as interactive. It's a historical story. Things are meaningful. In the meantime, over in Greece, we've got Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle thinking philosophically also about a God who is transcendent. Now, Aristotle has a student by the name of Alexander the Great, and he's a mighty general. And where does he go? Among other places, he goes to Israel, and he brings the Greek language and Greek philosophy with him. And the Jews there get really interested, and so they translate his Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language, which is just loaded with Greek philosophy. And that's a couple centuries before Jesus. So when we get to the New Testament, it's written by Jews who speak Greek. We have a cataract. The New Testament is like a waterfall, but two different rivers are flowing over the edge. So let's just take a look here at some of the titles Jesus has in the New Testament. Gospel of Mark, probably the first one written, keeps calling Jesus the Son of Man, huios tou anthropou. And then we get to the climax when Jesus is crucified and he becomes the Son of God, huios tou theou. Matthew, Mark, and Luke use the phrase Son of God. No, that's family language. That's personal language. When Jesus prays the Lord's Prayer, he says, Abba, Father. So you and I pray to God, our heavenly parent, just as a child would greet his or her father or mother or someone beloved. Then we get to the Gospel of John. What happens? Jesus is described as the Logos. The Logos? What's that? John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, ein archein, ho logos kai ho logos proston theon, which reminds us of what? Genesis chapters 1:1 to 2:4a, where God speaks and the world comes into existence. Jesus is God's Word by which all things in the world are created. Logos, yes, it means word, but oh, so much more. Logos is rationality. Jesus, as the Logos, is the mind of God, the inner thoughts of the divine. Think about that word Logos in English. Where do you find it? Logic. Yeah, to think logically comes from the Logos. To think rationally about any subject, we use the word logy, right? Anthropology is what? The study of the human race. Biology, the study of life. And just think of all the ologies that you probably studied in high school or college, huh? That's what Jesus is. Jesus, according to John 1:14, is the incarnation of the divine logos, the inner thought of God by which all things are created. And when science was born in Western Europe with Copernicus and Kepler, Galileo and Newton, they all thought that by studying the mathematics by which the universe runs, they would learn the very thoughts in God's mind. Classical theism, taking the very personal experience that Israel had with God and filtering it through the abstract and philosophical and rational concepts of the great Greek thinkers. Christians are Trinitarian monotheists, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox really obey God's first commandment about never making an image of God the Father. Jesus maybe, but not God the Father. So here are the three angels visiting Abraham at Mamre, three human beings, by the artist Rublev. This is in Moscow in a chapel in the Kremlin. And this is an icon. An icon, if you're an Orthodox Christian, is a window that is blurry on our side because we can only see what looks this worldly, but it opens us to that which transcends, lies beyond. And so the three angels that Mamre represent, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Don't ask which is which. The three angels visiting Abraham in Rublev's painting point us toward God as Trinity. We don't literally think God is three angels having dinner together. Similarly, language such as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is symbolic language. God isn't literally a father, literally with a son, bound together literally by a spirit. No, this is highly relational language in order to demonstrate the personal nature of the divine life. And the Father and the Son, the first two persons of the Trinity, are mutually defining. You can't have a son without a father, and you can't be a father without a son. And the Holy Spirit, according to St. Augustine, is the love which binds the differentiated first two persons together in a single unit. Preeminently, the Trinity reveals to us divine personhood in relationship. Now, here's Catherine Maury Lacuna, systematic theologian at Notre Dame University. Unfortunately, she passed away a little too early in life because of cancer. But in her fine treatment of God as Trinity, called God with Us, she emphasizes again and again that everything having to do with God as Trinity is relational and personal in character. Here's a passage. Because of God's outreach to the creature, God is said to be essentially relational, ecstatic. Ecstatic is a word that means going out. EC is out. Static means to stand or step. Ecstatic, fecund, that is to say, fertile or giving rise to life. Alive is passionate love. God is passionate love. That passion is the work of the Holy Spirit. Divine life is therefore also our life. Trinitarian theology could be described as par excellence a theology of relationship. Now, this is Catherine Maury Lacuna's interpretation of the Trinity. It's mine too. I'm with her 100% on this. And here's why it's important for the current discussion. There are critics of classical theism, and the critics say they don't like classical theism because God is impersonal, divorced, separated, unrelational in character. Well, take a look at the Trinity as Catherine Maury Lacuna describes it. Does that look impersonal and out of relationship to you? Classical theists in our period of time feel like they're standing with their backs against a wall facing a firing squad. Ready, aim. The bullets being fired claim classical theists are guilty of purveying a model of God in which God is non-relational. If God is omnipotent and omniscient and eternal and immutable, then God doesn't really interact with either the world of nature or your and my soul. And these critics firing the bullets want a more relational God. They seem to be angry at deism, but they call it theism. And as we just saw, Catherine Maury Lacuna's Trinitarian theism is fundamentally relational in character, be that as it may. She has to stand with her back against the wall while the critics raise their rifles to shoot. There has arisen within American evangelical theology a response to the criticism, a defense of God being relational, but it's still the God of classical theism. And we call this school of thought open theism, or as Richard Rice puts it, Richard and I were theologians in graduate school at one time, an open view of God that says reality itself and consequently God's experience of reality. Note that God is experiencing reality, not just dictating what reality ought to be. God's experience of reality are essentially open rather than closed. This means that God experiences the events of the world he has created. God created the world, and now the events are experienced by God, especially the events of human history, that's you and me, as they happen, rather than all at once in some timeless, eternal perception. So God is involved in time, say the open theists. This also means that not even God knows the future. There's been a long time debate. You see it in Augustine and John Calvin and others, where if God knows the future and the future cannot be different, therefore it follows that everything is predestined or predetermined. Not for the open theists. Not even God knows the future in all its details. Some parts remain indefinite until they actually occur, and so they can't be known in advance. Otherwise, the idea of freedom is meaningless. So you can see the argument here. Unless there's an actual open future, and God can know all the potentials that are open, but what God cannot know is what actually will happen, just as you and I cannot know what actually will happen. And this not knowing what actually will happen is what makes freedom possible. So the open theists are trying to assure us of two things. Number one, God experiences nature and history and even what's going on in your and my individual soul. And then secondly, God is concerned about making certain that you and I have freedom so that our actions actually affect our future. What is not part of this scheme, notice, is the emphasis on the Trinitarian life. That's what we saw in Catherine Mowry LaCuna. Here in open theism, it seems to be a more general understanding of God, using the classical categories, but at the same time trying to demonstrate that God is relational. There are a number of rather angry agnostics and atheists and others who um, believe in a radical separation between church and state on the grounds of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, who want the word God eliminated from public discourse. Well, what are you going to do if you kind of like the word God but don't want to violate the First Amendment? Well, you disconnect God with religion. So note what happened in 2010 with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals dealing with the phrase under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. It is religious, but it doesn't represent a prayer. So you can use the word God in public as long as you don't pray. Or how about in God we trust on currency? That's okay, because here God is ceremonial and patriotic, but not religious. Whew. Boy, we don't want too much religion, do we? We have just taken a look at deism, in which God creates the world out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. But once the world is created, God has relatively little to do with its day-to-day operations. Theism similarly holds that God creates the world out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, but once created, God is constantly engaged in the world. God is personally invested in the world. In Trinitarian theism, God actually enters the world in the incarnation and continues to be present in the world through the Holy Spirit. For both deism and theism, the world is radically different from God. That's not the case with our next model, pantheism, in which God and the world are isomorphic. The world is imbued with the being of God. My principal example for pantheism is Hinduism. But you might object, wait a minute, Ted, I thought you said that Hindus were polytheists. Well, I did say that, but they're also pantheists. Yes, you can be both a polytheist and a pantheist at the same time. Here, this relief looks kind of like a trinity, right? We got the gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is thought to be the creator god, Vishnu, your providential sustainer god. Shiva is called the destroyer, but that means relieving us from the grip of the past so that new things can emerge. All three of them, however, are not distinct and discrete. They're all expressions of one underlying reality, Brahman. Don't confuse the words Brahma and Brahman. Brahman is the underlying totality of divine reality. Brahma is one manifestation among others. Here is Ted's handy dandy little map to find your way through Hindu pantheism to Hindu polytheism. In the upper middle, you see Maya and illusion, personal gods and goddesses. That's where you and I would live on a day-to-day basis as a Hindu believer. We interact with one another, with the world, and with the many gods and goddesses in the polytheistic pantheon. And this world in which we live is semi-illusory. It's not unreal, but we certainly don't have a grip on reality. Our day-to-day life is filled with plurality and multiplicity, when in fact, ultimately, reality is one and only one undifferentiated thing. So let's go down now to the bottom middle, to the one full, not yet embodied divine reality, Brahman, undifferentiated unity, sometimes called pure consciousness. And it is from Brahman that all things in the plural and illusionary world in which you and I live come from. Note, stage one are the three gods we just looked at: Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the sustainer; and Shiva, the destroyer. Then, as we rise further, Vishnu becomes represented by and present in Krishna, who then spreads out in multiple avatars. And some on this list of avatars, sometimes Jesus is actually listed. So Jesus would be an incarnation or avatar of Krishna from Vishnu, from Brahman. So there's a connection to ultimate reality, but a couple times removed. Now, what is important here is that Brahman is the source of all divinity. So even you and I, who are physical and finite and separated from others, we still have a level of Brahmanic divinity within us, and we'll practice yoga, we'll practice meditation in order to realize that our separate self, our Atman, is really at one with Brahman, that we are sacred, even if it's not noticeable on a day-to-day basis. Hinduism provides us with an excellent example of pantheism in the Asian mystical history. But here in the West, recently, over the last few decades, a version of scientific pantheism has been developing. Those who advocate it call themselves religious naturalists. This is Ursula Goodenough, a biologist. And Ursula would deny that there's a God independent of the world, beyond the world, outside the world, but the natural world is itself sacred, and it's everywhere sacred. If you and I don't notice the sacrality that's in nature, that's because we're not looking for it. But if we search nature in the depths, we will find its sacred dimension. Well, we've just looked at pantheism, where all things are divine, whether we know it or not, realize it or not. Now, panentheism, in which the world is within God's life, but the world does not exhaust the being of God. This is Arthur Peacock, formerly at Oxford University in England. He passed away a few years ago. One of the pioneer leaders in the field of theology and natural science. Panentheism is actually a philosophical position. It doesn't really adhere to some religious tradition somewhere. Here is Arthur's definition. Panentheism is the belief that the being of God includes and penetrates the whole universe, so that every part of it exists in him, but that his being is more than and is not exhausted by the universe. Panentheists like to think of the world, the physical world, as God's body. And if you think about a human mind and body relationship. The mind is more than the body, but you're not going to have a mind independently of the body. And so God is the mind of the world. This metaphor was devised by Alfred North Whitehead about a century ago. And towards the end of the 20th century, a number of feminist theologians picked up on panentheism and began to speak of the world as God's body and adopted a version of Whiteheadian panentheism as their model for articulating how God and the world relate. Arthur Peacock is a panentheist, but he is not a process theologian. Throughout the 20th century, the school of thought which gave greatest attention to panentheism and honed to perfection the doctrine are the disciples of Alfred North Whitehead, known either as process philosophers or process theologians. Most of the activity was centered at the University of Chicago, so it's sometimes called the Chicago School, and leading exponents in the late 20th century and early 21st have been Schubert Ogden, John Cobb, David Griffin, Marjorie Hewitt Suhaki, and others. And in this scheme, God represents the metaphysical principles. God doesn't stand outside the metaphysical principles. And of course, as we've already said, there's a strong emphasis on relationality. Everything is related to everything else in the process metaphysics. Here is an example of a feminist theologian who employs the model of panentheism with the world as God's body, Sally McFaig, who's had a long and distinguished career, and one of her emphases has been ecological theology and ethics. So she wants to think of the world, especially planet Earth, as the body of God. And just as you and I love our own bodies and try to maintain good health, so also God loves the universe, especially planet Earth, and wants to maintain the health of our planet, and so should we. The world as God's body is appropriate for our time, McFaig writes. It focuses attention on the near, on the neighbor, on the earth, on meeting God not later in heaven, but here and now. We meet God in the world, and especially in the flesh of the world, in feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and reducing the greenhouse effect. How do you like this painting? It's the creation of a good friend, Kristen Quizzle. Kind of earthy. Acorns make oak trees, right? Have you ever read closely those insurance policies on which you pay premiums? Ever read the phrase act of God? We'll take a look at the picture here, a memo from the desk of God, and checked off our flood, fire, riots, and earthquakes. When God acts, things really happen, and we want to insure ourselves against acts of God. Well, atheists don't talk very often about acts of God, neither do agnostics. Atheism, theism, of course, is the belief in God. You put that privative A in front of it and you negate it. So you can have a weak atheist that says, I don't think there is a God, or a strong atheist that says, I firmly believe there is no God. Agnosticism, similarly, GNOS is the word for knowledge. You put A in front of it, you get agnosticism. It could mean in its weak form, gee, I'm not sure, or in its stronger form, I am confident that one cannot prove one way or the other whether there is a god. Is Buddhism atheistic? Well, if you think of high-octane philosophical Buddhism in which fundamental reality is not divine, it is sunyata or emptiness, then, yeah, Buddhism is going to look atheistic. Some years ago, I taught in Pilamatalawa, Sri Lanka, and stayed with a lovely, lovely family, the Ilangasinghe family, and daughter Diksha, age 5, she and I became the best of friends. We would play games on the living room floor and color in her coloring book. And here she is, standing in front of this magnificent and humongous Buddha in repose. Just imagine the work of the stone carvers to create this great historical beauty. You're in my daily life, if we're a Buddhist, is lived at the level of pratitya samutpada, codependent co-arising. There is no creator beyond the world. There is no first cause. Rather, you and I are just caught in a never-ending nexus of cause and effect. Reality is like balls on a billiard or pool table that are just bouncing back and forth and sending one another in various directions. Even you and myself, that precious inner life that we think of as our essence or our soul, is at the level of pratitya samutpada. Our soul is not eternal. No, the object of Buddhist meditation and spirituality is to realize that at bottom we are a non-self, anatta, that sunyata is the ground of all things and it is empty. Remember, the Buddha broke off from the Upanishadic tradition in pre-Hinduism, where Brahman is the fullness of all reality between time, before time and form. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha Gautama, the Sakyamuni who became the Buddha, says that the fullness of Brahman is logically the same as the emptiness underlying all phenomenal reality. So that means you cannot have God as ultimate in hard-nosed Buddhism. Yet you and I probably have Buddhist friends who have a rich tradition with gods and goddesses and rituals and all of that that belongs to a religious tradition. But here's the key insight: those gods and goddesses exist at the level of pratitya samutpada. They're not ultimate. And in that sense, then, the Buddhist is atheistic. However, a Buddhist atheist is not exactly the same as a modern Western scientized materialist atheist. If you're an atheist, you have to have an account to explain why it is that other people believe in God, but you don't. One of the accounts that begins already in ancient Greece is the projection account that God is somehow or other created by the human imagination and then projected onto this screen of divinity. So here's a thesis that we get by Critias of Athens in his play Sisyphus, that people create the idea of an omniscient, all-knowing God for purposes of social control. If you've ever tried to steal something, you know you want to do it in secret so that nobody sees you. And if nobody sees you, you get away with the crime. Well, how will a society protect itself from thieves? Well, if we could create in each individual a conscience, then by conscience, they wouldn't commit a crime. So the problem is that laws passed by a government, laws on their own don't eliminate crime. What they do is encourage criminals to commit the crime but keep it a secret. How can we remedy this problem? Well, create the idea of a God. A wise and clever man invented fear for mortals. He introduced the divine, saying that there is a God flourishing with immortal life, hearing and seeing with his mind and thinking of everything and caring about these things. And even if you plan anything in secret, you will not escape the gods in this. God sees your heart in secret, and the larger body politic then gets protected from your crimes by your conscience. How do you like that theory? Another variant on the projection theory to explain religion is that of Xenophanes, also an ancient Greek, who thought that the gods of polytheism were created by imaginary projections of people. After all, Zeus and Aphrodite look kind of like the people next door. So if horses were to be religious, their gods would look like horses. And if cattle would be religious, their gods would look like cattle. So it's a natural human propensity to make a god an overgrown example of myself or yourself. The projection theory was revived by Sigmund Freud at the end of the 19th century, and you hear it again amongst many atheists since 2006, when we've had a kind of revival of atheism. And the projection theory goes something like this, that you and I feel weak and anxious in the face of the course of events we can't control. So we project an image of our Father onto heaven, a heavenly Father who takes care of us, especially in circumstances when nobody else wants to take care of us. So there's no real God there, but we imagine a loving and caring God simply because we have need for that kind of a God. It's easy to recognize how common projection is in your and my everyday experience. We naturally project onto heaven things that we experience here on earth, as well as project the things that we want and desire. Well, what happens then if you're a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim loyal to Moses and the first commandment? Well, this human activity of projecting images onto heaven is condemned as idolatry, because the true God is revealed as mystery. And you can't eclipse the divine mystery by giving it a name or an image. Now we're in a dilemma. We can't think as human beings without images, right? And at the same time, we're told by revelation from God that you can't have an image of God without risking idolatry. C.S. Lewis tells the story about how he, as a child, had raised this problem with his mother when thinking about the first commandment. His mother said, do not create any images of God, whether a painting or a statue or even a mental image. So C.S. Lewis sat down and tried to think about God without any images in his mind. And he thought and he thought and he thought, and he said, finally, God came out looking like a great, massive sea of tapioca pudding. Well, the message there is that you and I are not going to think without one image or another. So, what has developed then in the biblical tradition, which includes Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is the understanding that our language must be symbolic in character. Yes, we have images of God, but we both affirm and deny the image. As I said before, the tradition shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims strongly forbids any images of the first person of the Trinity. Yet, in the Latin West, this image of the first person of the Trinity as an old man with a beard that looks kind of like Santa Claus did arise when the Protestant Reformation came along, especially the Reformed, the Presbyterians today, and the Baptists today. They went around getting rid of all those images of God the Father because they wanted to return to loyalty to the first commandment. In their defense, the Roman Catholics then, who are quite used to these images of God as an old man with a white beard, want to say, well, we know literally that God doesn't have a white beard and is not a man. But because of what we learned from C.S. Lewis, we can't live without one image or another. So let's both affirm the image as a bridge between God and our own experience, but at the same time deny it because God, the true God, is transcendent, unnameable, and unimaginable. What the theologian does is try to provide a concept that interprets the symbolic language and the images of the tradition in philosophically sound concepts. So we don't really expect the concepts to literally describe God, but we do expect them to have some coherence while having some reference to what we say symbolically and what we try to communicate through images. Some images are going to be better than others. Here's feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther, who recognizes, kind of like Xenophanes, that in a given historical period, the images of God and the social structure, especially the authoritarian structure of a patriarchal society, all come together in a single package. Most images of God in religions are modeled after the ruling class of society. We certainly saw that in the case of ancient Egypt, right? The pharaohs wanted to have an image of God that blessed their monarchies. Okay, so Rosemary goes on, in biblical religion, the image of God is that of a patriarchal father above the created world who relates to Israel as his wife and children. And certainly there is personal language within the Hebrew scriptures that looks like this, although there's lots of other language for God as well. But clearly, in the Latin tradition prior to the Reformation, we do get this picture of God as an old man with a white beard, and this is Rosemary Radford Ruther's complaint, that functions to bless having kings as old men with white beards, and to bless a clergy that is made up of men only, and a patriarchal ethos, both within the church and the larger society. And so, if you want in our own generation to be liberated from the oppression Rosemary suggests that we somehow or other mollify, if not eliminate, this particular image of God because it does damage. It's abusive. Our topic here is atheism and agnosticism, and we've been supplying accounts that would serve the atheist position by explaining why it is that some people are religious even though no God exists. The word agnosticism was given to us by Thomas Huxley at the end of the 19th century. And at that point, Huxley was engaged in a battle in which, on his side, he conscripted Charles Darwin and the book Origin of Species over against the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and he was pitting reason against faith. So, agnosticism for Huxley means that reason becomes the bottom line, the trump card, the hammer that nails in the nail. By reason alone, you can't decide whether there's a God or not, and taking the agnostic position is an act of faith. Agnosticism is one form of faith that sits parallel to and side by side with the faith of the Church of England. How do you like this cartoon? I don't know. Actually, agnostics don't throw up their hands. Remember, they have faith in reason. If there is such a thing as a worldwide leader of the atheist movement, that is probably Richard Dawkins at the University of Oxford. Very colorful, popular, and actually respected leader in British society and on other continents as well. In my interpretation, he kind of replaces Bertrand Russell, who for the first 2/3 of the 20th century had been the voice of atheism and skepticism, and actually a supporter of world peace in Great Britain. And Richard Dawkins may have taken the crown from the late Russell and now wears it. Dawkins is known in scientific circles for having developed the selfish gene theory to explain evolution in 1976, but more recently, especially after 2006, he has been carrying the banner for atheist thinking. Take a look at the red print here. Note the first thing he does is he makes the question of God's existence a scientific question. It's a hypothesis. Here's the hypothesis. There exists a superhuman, supernatural intelligence who deliberately designed and created the universe and everything in it, including us. So Dr. Dawkins, as a scientist, investigates this hypothesis and disconfirms it. Ask religious people whom you know, do you think the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis or not? And see what they say. He introduces PAP, the permanent agnosticism principle. Atheism and agnosticism overlap quite a bit. I believe the existence of God as a scientific hypothesis is, at least in principle, investigatable. God, though not technically disprovable, is very, very improbable indeed. So on the one hand, is agnostic. You can't technically prove that God does not exist. On the other hand, you can render a scientific judgment that God's existence is very improbable. Then the banner, as he leads the march, reads, I am attacking God, all gods, anything and everything supernatural, wherever and whenever they have been or will be invented. That suggests maybe he's relying on the projection theory that we saw in Xenophanes and the other Greeks, revived by Sigmund Freud. How do you like this cartoon? What I can't believe. In recent years, atheists have been raising two arguments. The first is that God does not exist. The second one, which is drawing a lot of attention, is that religion is violent. People who believe in God are prone to conflict and violence. Therefore, a truly moral society will rid itself of religion. Here's Sam Harris. Religious faith remains a perpetual source of conflict. You see this amongst the sociobiologists such as Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson at Harvard, who want to argue that religion is a more primitive stage in human evolution, bent on tribal loyalty and making extinct those tribes that compete against them. So religion is fundamentally violent in character, and society is going to be better off when we get rid of religion. Sam Harris attacks Islam with unusual venom. The idea that Islam is a peaceful religion hijacked by extremists, which of course many defenders of Islam were saying in the decade following the 9/11 tragedy, that Islam itself is peaceful, but those who crashed planes into the World Trade Center were only extremists. He rejects this. The idea that Islam is a peaceful religion hijacked by extremists is a fantasy, because most Muslims are utterly deranged by their religious faith. That is to say, religion is at root, at essence, dangerous, and maybe Muslims are the most dangerous of all. If the problem in society is that religion is violent, and if we are to experience world peace, we need to get rid of religion, what would be the method for eliminating religion? Well, Sam Harris proposes a nuclear first strike. We'll bomb the Muslims. That's a good way to bring about world peace, is to drop a nuclear bomb. Now, where will you drop that nuclear bomb? We have a large population of Muslims in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. I wonder if Mr. Harris would drop a bomb on Minnesota. As I said, the two leading principles of today's atheists are, first, that God does not exist, and then secondly, that religion is violent. And in the mind of Sam Harris, those two go together. What makes us violent is our belief in a non-existent God. So he fires his 45 revolvers at the God of the Bible. The biblical God is a fiction, like Zeus and the thousands of other dead gods who most sane human beings now ignore. We took a look at Moses, the God in the burning bush. Like Zeus, not really. In fact, anything like Zeus is flatly rejected by the first commandment and the tradition followed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Atheism today is itself a religious, or maybe we'll say a non-religious or anti-religious movement. So those Christians who want to become atheists are invited to go through a denial of baptism, an atheist coming out party. Our topic here is atheism and agnosticism. And remember, Thomas Huxley emphasized how for the agnostic, it is reason that is the trump card and the bottom line. And this has led many atheists to claim that atheism has a patent on science, that science is there to support the materialist, physicalist, and atheistic worldview. Like a horse and carriage, atheism and science get married. Here's Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winning physicist. Anything that we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done and may in the end be our greatest contribution to civilization. We need an army of scientists to march in war against the irrational believers in religion. It looks like the editors of Time magazine simply accept without critical question what Steven Weinberg says, that science and atheism belong together, so you can pit science over against God. Really? The actual articles in this Time magazine contradict. The cover, Richard Dawkins has some coverage, but so also does Francis Collins. Francis is the current director of the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. He's a medical doctor, a geneticist, famed for his uncovering the gene for cystic fibrosis on chromosome 4 and heading the U.S. government-sponsored Human Genome Project during its final years. He's an extremely accomplished and respected scientist, and the poor benighted Francis believes in God. He's a devout evangelical Christian. From Francis's point of view, atheism and science don't go together. Science is a beautiful thing for somebody who loves God and loves his neighbor. Now, Francis, the scientist who loves both God and neighbor, proceeds to try to put together his understanding of the evolutionary history of life on our planet with what he believes about God as creator and redeemer. God pre-planned the process of mutation and selection. That is to say, he affirms Charles Darwin's theory of speciation in evolution. He goes on to say that God knew it would eventually produce the human race. Now, at this point, we can't tell whether Francis is a deist or a theist, because both a deist and a theist could say that God pre-planned the process of evolution. Then Francis clarifies his position. He's not a deist. No, he's a theist. God created us humans for a relationship, which both God and we can enjoy through prayer. So Francis is a theist, and you and I can enjoy interactively our relationship with God through prayer. Jesus Christ is a divine invasion of the natural world. Now, someone who is a theist is likely to say that. Whether you think of this divine invasion as a miracle or not, it's certainly God interacting with the creative world, the world God created for the purposes of redemption. What kind of God either exists or does not exist in the controversy between the atheists and religious people? The God of classical theism with all the omnis, omnipotence, omnipresence, etc. The God of Israel with the mighty hand and outstretched arm who rescued Hebrew slaves from captivity in Egypt. Zeus flirting with Aphrodite. The gods and goddesses of Pratitya Samutpada in Buddhism, or the avatars in Hinduism. What kind of god or goddess is getting rejected by the materialism and physicalism of contemporary Western atheism? That's an important question. However, frankly, and it's my opinion, I think the more important question is whether or not God is gracious, whether or not ultimate reality is caring and loving and planning a redemptive destiny in which this creation becomes renewed in a new creation. I want either a God of grace or no God. If God is only the designer of the laws of nature, I'll say whoop-de-doo. I think it's the God who promises the forgiveness of sin and the resurrection to eternal life. Now, that's a God that I hope exists. Wandering in the darkness of the cathedral in Ulm, Germany, I found this painting. It's pre-Reformation. God the Father is sitting there in that great white beard. But look what's happening. The crucified Jesus is on his lap. The Father is grieving. Grieving. Does heaven grieve over the sufferings on earth? Is God, the creator of all things, actually engaged in the world? Does God respond to the world with passion, love, and redemptive action? Oh, yes, this painting violates the first commandment by giving us an image of God, but at the same time, it gives us an authentic bridge to the God of grace. To the God of grace. It's kind of hard to prove to an atheist or an agnostic that A, there is a God, and B, that God is gracious, yet I don't want to have faith in anything else, anything less. Well, that's my personal opinion. God is dead, announced philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Without speaking, God says Nietzsche is dead. What we've been doing for the last few minutes is examining with some care the multiple ways in which people conceive of divinity and deity and God. We've called these models, conceptual models, which are a bit abstracted from the primary utterances, so to speak, when people first talk about their experiences with God or with the absence of God. They speak in rather concrete and specific terms. So it takes a theologian or a philosopher to extract from the symbolic language and from the images what is necessary to create a coherent model. So we have been talking somewhat in abstractions as we compare one model of God over against another model of God. Hopefully, in our inventory of models of God, you have found one or more that you have a lot of sympathy with, or perhaps even a major commitment to. And at the same time, I hope that you've learned what your neighbor thinks, and now you can think quite empathetically about what your neighbor believes. Bye-bye.